Well, the General Assembly is on, and there's a lot of hope and a lot of excitement and a lot of anxiety in Africa. A number of Africans say that the world has not shown Africa the kind of importance that Africa should be shown. And I read an article by Chief Seleman Kitenge that he entitled "The G20 UN Security Council Africa's Diplomatic Agenda." And I'll start with you, Chief Seleman Kitenge, in Tanzania. What point were you trying to make in this your article?
All right. Thank you so much for this great opportunity to share my insight. Actually, one of the main critical points that I was trying to make in this particular article is the fact that despite Africa being one of the potential partner in the global development issues, but yet its participation and in most of the key decision-making tables is quite minimal. So, for instance, when you look at the G20 summit, you could find that for the past few years, Africa has been part of it, but only as an observer. But yet, when it comes to major global development crises, Africa is mostly impacted by them. So, in this particular article, I was trying to indicate how important it is for Africa now to not be at the back, but
Chief Kitenge, we seem to be losing you. While we wait for you to get back, let me go to Dr. Ekwo. Dr. Ekwo, you have a completely different perspective in your writings. And the focus of most of your writing is that Africa should be given more prominence in global affairs. Can you take us through your argument?
Yeah, that's so true. As a matter of fact, part of the argument I've also made in several fora, including when I addressed the Pan-African Parliament in South Africa in 2012, was that the future of the world is in Africa. Let's face it. And that is why, like the last speaker also said something about Africa being a part of being on the table in matters of economic development and stuff. And like he was also trying to talk about the G20. We recognize that G20 actually, of course, we know we started in 1999 during the Asian financial crisis, first of all with finance ministers of major economies of 20 countries. Before a decade later, during the global crisis now, heads of state now joined the 20. But actually, when I got the news that it's now G20 plus one, you know, like referring to Africa as just one country, because like I stay in the United States and I see ignorance all the time about how people view Africa. Even some of my students, some of them don't even know that Africa is a country. Some of them think it's a country. And that same scenario plays on a global level. So if, for example, Italy is not even up to a certain states in Nigeria, yet it's a member of G20 as a single entity. Yeah, I recognize AU and all the fault lines about formation of AU will try to copy EU, but somehow they find some differences because for it to get into AU, unlike getting into EU, there is just no steps to take to get into AU. Just because you're an African country now, they become a member of AU, unlike EU. So my goal would be to see a very major power like Nigeria, Africa, and even Egypt and all that being recognized as single countries, not looking every 55 countries, you're calling them one. There's no way 55 is equivalent to one. All right. So there are so many small countries that cannot match the population, and all the elements of power that exist in other African countries. And part of it, there are so many explanations for what is happening. We know that, including the way our leaders have really, conducted themselves. We do have that potential to provide leadership, particularly in Nigeria, in being seen as a very major force. I also know that way back, I think in the middle 80s or so, if by way of taking back to history, there was something that one administration set up then called Concert of Medium Powers, something equivalent to NATO. Through some kangaroo arrangements, the West, scuttled that. These were some, look at even ECOMOG we set up. There would have been certain steps that will be able to make Africa or other countries recognize our potential, that we can, handle our issues. So just like all these coups happening here and there, and we have some former colonial governments having some influence in the way we operate. So I think that we are ripe enough to be seen as separate different countries. And the challenge also, okay, we say G20 plus one. So who will go there and speak for, can Francophone African country or Anglophone African country speak for the situation happening in the other areas? So we don't have that unity of voice to be able to advance the agenda of Africa in an organization like that. So I would rather prefer a situation where countries are recognized for their might, for their strength, considering all the elements of power, population, economic strength, and all that. Then, honestly, unfortunately, Nigeria is a disappointment. Let's just face that. Because if Nigeria had played a role in Africa, perhaps these things wouldn't be happening. I will yield and hear some other perspectives. But my point also is that people should stop treating Africa as one. We are 55 countries. Because nobody says G20 plus Asia.
Okay. Let's go back to Kitenge in Tanzania. Well, Kitenge, sorry we lost you, but you've heard some of the argument that Dr. Ekwo in New York is putting forward. You are talking about G20, and he thinks that the G20 and the way it's being handled might be an insult to Africa. Is that something you want to associate yourself with?
Always, it's good to make one step at a time. So for me, I would say that for now, it's a good step towards Africa being included in these key platforms. But yet, I think I would also agree with Doctor that it is not enough. I think we need Africa to be more included in such platform, considering the fact that, as Doctor said, we have many countries, like 55 member states, who have different culture, but also different interests. So I think a consideration of geopolitical mighty, socioeconomic aspect, I think they should consider that so that Africa could have more seats in these global platforms.
Let's go to your argument in your article. Let's go back to that argument. You talked about why Africa should get a place in the Security Council and so on and so forth. Can you let us into it some more?
Yes, I think, the UN was established quite some time ago, over, I think, around 1945. But, as the time goes, even the number of the UN Security Council members, well, they included new members, including China, which was not there before. So I think Africa now needs to take its place as well. Because when you look at the current structure, usually African countries participate in the UN Security Council as observers on rotational basis. But this, in my opinion, is not enough. I think Africa needs to have a permanent seat, considering the number of people that Africa has. Africa is 1.3 billion people, yet does not have representation. But also Africa is quite wealthy when we talk about natural resources, which are actually most of the European and Western countries consider as potential for Africa. So I think in that context, Africa need to take its rightful place in the UN Security Council.
Kitenge, will Africa be represented as one Africa, or is it going to be represented by a nation?
All right, and that's a very technical question, but I think, in my opinion, geopolitical representation should be considered. You know, we have 55 member states, and I think, in my opinion, Africa should at least have 2 seats in the UN Security Council. And here we have to consider the criteria of the, socio-economic, social, but also economic, mighty, and all other aspects that are important to ensure that Africa is well represented in the UN Security Council.
Okay, gentlemen, let's look at how ready Africa is, because Dr. Ekwo had said something about Africans not actually providing the kind of leadership that they should provide, not doing the things that they should do to make them a force to be reckoned with in global politics. Let me come back to you, Dr. Ekwo. What should Africa, because we are concluding now, what should Africa be doing so that, if you don't say you are, nobody knows that you are. So what should Africa be doing to make itself more relevant in the scheme of things globally?
In a nutshell, the answer is leadership, economic development, and economic integration. Why I emphasize economic integration? Because this argument about having a permanent seat at the Security Council, that has been a long argument. But when you also know the history of how the UN was formed, Africa was not even on the seat around. They were not even part of it. But people have been talking about reforming United Nations to reflect the global nature of that organization. And like you rightly said, for us to do that, for Africans to really be seen as serious, they should be able to create very positive impact in terms of direction, in terms of leadership. The fact that almost every African country still depends on the West to tell them what to do, it's unsustainable. If we continue to play that role, look at all the Francophone African countries. They are tethered to France. Some of them, if you make a call from here, US to maybe Senegal, sometimes it passes through France and all that. They are not independent, even though they claim they are independent. Other Francophone countries, Nigeria, etc., yes, they call them, they are independent, but they still play the quote-unquote servant stuff to the West. Now, when you are put in that kind of paternalistic relationship where you can't say, here I am, right? And let me talk about economic integration, because economy is the most important thing. I've often wondered, like some of us will say that Africa, we are too diverse, that we can never come together, different languages, this and that. But what unites people is money. So if we're able to develop strong economic integration in Africa, that will help. In Europe, the entire Europe, after the war, they have different languages. They are scattered as like Africa as well. But the economic community they set up then, that's also part of the EU and all that, helps them to kind of reduce those differences because they are pursuing one economic interest. African states do not have a free trade, Africa free trade agreement and all that. If it works the way it's envisioned, that could also give us some leverage, so that people are able to trade across borders, move from point A to point B, no visa restrictions and all that. That can also help, because there are a lot of people in Africa with a lot of ingenuity and creativity that are stifled because they can't move around.
There's no doubt that if Africa does what you are suggesting, Africa becomes a very huge market that cannot be ignored. Yeah. So let's go to Kitenge. You heard what Doctor said, and I want to ask: how can Africa be intentional about creating relevance around Africa so that we can be treated with a lot of respect?
Actually, as Doctor said, if we want to maintain our relevance, the key word here should be unity. And the unity of Africa will only be possible if we are integrated politically, we are integrated economically, and integrated socially. Only when all these three elements are unified, it's that when Africa will have a unity voice and become relevant at the world stage.
Let me come back to you, Dr. Ekwo in New York. Here we are. The hunger is ongoing. What should Africa take away from this session?
Given recent developments in Africa, especially about coups and all that, like I said in another interview that I was granted by a station here, in the 90s, the world celebrated Africa's transformation from military dictatorship to democracy, multipartyism, and all that became the norm then, right? But today, there seems to be a recession in democracy. Like I also mentioned, it's not just in Africa, though. Even in the United States, there's a terrible recession of democracy. Everyone is talking about democratic backsliding and all that. So I think that what they should emphasize is how to consolidate democracy in Africa, because that is just a solution. And consolidating democracy will mean citizens' capacity to jettison dictators. Because when people stay in power too long, there's one popular politician in Nigeria those days, MK Abiola. There's one phrase I remember he said that if you stay in the toilet too long, flies will drive you away. So when most people stay in power for too long, people will just come and drive them away.
And they lose it.
And they lose it.